After I reviewed Dead Space a few years ago, it's become one of my more beloved survival horror games. It's so reminiscent of Resident Evil 4 and does a great spin on its own thing to really make it stand out. What I'm holding here is the remake of it because I don't actually own Dead Space 2 physically. But we're talking about Dead Space 2 today, the sequel to Dead Space. Maybe they'll make a remake of that one at some point too, I don't know. But let's take a look and see if Dead Space 2, the original version, is as good as the first one.
A sequel to Dead Space is honestly something I was afraid of. With series creator Glenn Schofield and game director Michael Condrey leaving EA Redwood Shores, now rebranded the Visceral Games, development of Dead Space 2 was handled by many who worked on Dead Space 1 but now in more senior roles. The goal of the game was to make a refinement of Dead Space 1 while also incorporating more action elements to widen the appeal to a larger audience. And Dead Space 2 really knocks it out of the park in that regard, without sacrificing what makes Dead Space so terrifying. At this point, I highly recommend you check out my review of the first Dead Space game, because a lot of what Dead Space 1 does right carries over into Dead Space 2. Released in 2011 for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC, Dead Space 2 takes place a few years after the events of Dead Space 1, as Isaac Clarke wakes up on a space station, the Sprawl, orbiting Saturn's moon of Titan. With necromorphs crawling everywhere, Isaac must escape the station while also avoiding the director of the station, Tideman, who wants to create a marker by using the details inside Isaac's memories. Isaac also has to avoid the Church of Unitology, those who worship the marker and want to bring about a cataclysmic event called the Convergence to make us whole.
Make us whole again.
The Sprawl is sprawling, with loads of different locations. There's standard spaceship rooms, the Church of Unitology section, the nursery, underground mines, and EarthGov offices that add a lot of visual variety. You even get to explore the Ishimura, the ship from the first game, which is terrifying in its familiarity. While Dead Space did a great job with the theme of isolation inside the singular ship of the Ishimura, Dead Space 2 keeps a great scary atmosphere with multiple locations. The church is so unsettling, seeing how many delusional people have been brought to a faith surrounded aliens and the pursuit to be killed or die and be reborn. The nursery is more classically creepy, with mutated babies and children lurking around those corners. You still get that unsettling spaceship atmosphere in most of the game too. The variety just shines a lot here. All of the classic Dead Space weapons, alongside the shop and workbench systems, return in this game too. You can even specify with your locator how to lead you to the nearest shop or workbench instead of just your objective, which is a nice change. When I played, I still went with my tried and true loadout, the line gun, which just has amazing spread, and of course the Ripper, so you can go ahead and rip and tear. The default plasma cutter is always a staple here too, and I love it. Most enemies are the same from Dead Space 1, with a few new ones that require different strategies to defeat. The Pack are a bunch of childlike enemies that swarm you, and it's real fun to just rip and tear with the Ripper on these guys. And then there's my least favorite, the Stalkers. These necromorphs like to hide around corners, most of the time in maze-like areas, and then they just charge at you while screaming. With no indicator on your screen other than the sound roughly where they're coming from, it's really frustrating to navigate these mazes and not trying to get hit from them. I'm getting strong Resident Evil 4 hedge maze vibes from these guys. Gosh, like bitch! Towards the end of the game, you also encounter regenerating necromorphs that you can only slow down and not fully defeat. And this part is probably the most frustrating part of the game. I basically just ran as optimally as possible through this part because I was already loaded on a lot of ammo and at full health, so I couldn't be bothered with killing everyone here. The difficulty just skyrockets here because you get hit with a lot of necromorphs as well as ones that you just can't fully kill. You can only destroy their limbs and it just slows them down. Honestly frustrating. Core abilities like stasis and kinesis are the same as in the first game, and they lend to some pretty cool puzzles in this game too. We also see a return of the zero gravity sections, and these are way better. You get a much wider range of control, which really makes exploring these areas a lot more manageable. Sprinkled throughout this game are some larger set pieces, like running away from enemies or using quick-time events to survive wild situations, like giant tentacles slamming you or bigger boss enemies chasing you. Visceral Games credits a lot of these bigger showcase sequences here to be kind of a reference to what a lot of games during this era were doing, like the Uncharted series specifically, with a lot of its grander spectacle showcases. Which is kind of funny because this game also has a really awesome moment where you are hanging trapped upside down and shooting at necromorphs coming at you, which we see later on in The Last of Us. So it's kind of fun to see this ping pong of inspiration from Naughty Dog to Visceral to Naughty Dog. Just cool stuff. Even if it isn't a direct reference, it's still cool to see with that context while I was playing. Enemy design in Dead Space 2 has been shifted to accommodate this more action-oriented playstyle. There's a lot more cases where waves of enemies will descend upon Isaac and you have to defeat them to advance in the story. And a lot of these enhanced movement options in the game make it a lot easier to dispatch these with no issues. At times, I felt like this game was almost easier than Dead Space 1, mostly because it was a little bit less focused on the inventory management and more focused on just killing enemies. Like, I never had an issue being low on ammo in this game, and at one point I had like over 100 saw blades just from like picking up everything. Arguably one of the better changes in Dead Space 2 is giving Isaac Clarke a voice. Instead of the self-insert character we've become attached to in the previous game, here, Isaac has his own struggles and goals, and he can voice them. He can't move on from the events of the Ishimura, and his moments of psychosis and conversations with Nicole help him move on to acceptance. It was great seeing the even more terrifying and wild visuals Isaac sees throughout the game, and Nicole's influence on him is portrayed very well. She's a great plot device turned character that gives us some insight into Isaac as he tries to escape the Sprawl, and move on in his life. Alongside Isaac are two, let's say, companions that help him. Ellie, a machine-heavy operator, also tries to escape the Sprawl, and Strauss, another patient of the facility that has also had exposure to the marker, and his delusional rantings that help convey some elements of the story to both Isaac and the player. The last few hours of this game lead to the famous eye needle scene, in a moment that was one of the more excellent pairings of narrative and mechanical gameplay I've seen in a game. Just great stuff. The whole time Strauss is telling us the steps for how to destroy the marker, and Isaac's acceptance of his loss with Nicole being the key to truly destroying the marker, just an incredible moment. Dead Space 1 had Kendra and Hammond's constant arguing, which added more uneasiness to the whole situation, while Dead Space 2's Ellie and Strauss, in their own ways, offering assistance and banter, helps further ease that tension through the narrative, only for it to be built up again as you progress. I think both of these are strong approaches that achieve the same result in just different ways. Good horror has strong building of tension, but great horror has a greater control of the ease and tightening of that same tension repeatedly. Both Dead Space games have so far been excellent in this, while being incredibly atmospheric and immersive, and lend themselves to some good jump scares too. I feel like in a lot of ways, Dead Space 2 is almost a better game in all of its aspects when compared to Dead Space 1. We get a great variety of locations, great controls with better movement, and the same awesome weapons. More enemy types that require unique ways to defeat them, and a greater emphasis on Isaac's character and delusions in the game. I don't think it lessens Dead Space 1, but more so that the lean towards more action and variety here is a welcome change. It's really in its better movement and enemy design that complement that it feels better per se, but it doesn't sacrifice its horror identity, even if it is a little bit easier than its predecessor. Dead Space 2 also introduced a smaller multiplayer mode, which at this point I had not really an interest or desire to play, and honestly I doubt I could with servers being down probably at this point. It does kind of foreshadow a little bit some of the issues that Dead Space 3 has in terms of trying to embrace more of that action, add more multiplayer modes to get that widened appeal here, but you know, that's kind of a story for another time. With this year's Dead Space 1 remake introducing a whole new generation of gamers as such a great game, let's hope that Dead Space 2 gets the remake treatment soon as well.
And that is Dead Space 2. I am very glad I was able to play this game, and I can see why it is beloved by so many. But what do you think? How do you like Dead Space 2? Is it great in comparison to the first game? Which one do you think's better? Let me know in the comments below, and in the meantime, thank you so much for watching.
There you are, Isaac. We've been waiting for you. Now it's your turn!
Oh God. Ellie!
Step 3!
You owe me an eye, you bastard!
Holy moly.